thank you so much for agreeing to come on this platform. I really appreciate you making the time.
My pleasure to be with you.
All right.
Yeah. Thank you. I noticed I'm wearing the wrong, this happens to say Cambridge on it somewhere, but I know you're at Oxford, so that would be fun.
Yeah, that's not acceptable yet.
Actually, looking closer, it says Canterbury, so we're fine.
Okay, nice. So yeah, just to start things off, for anyone interested, in sports science and nutrition in South Africa, the name Professor Tim Noakes is very familiar. But for people who don't know you, for people for whom this is their first experience of you, may you please share with us who you are, how you grew up, and what kinds of experiences you think inspired or influenced you to go into science, medicine in particular, as well as this, thing you've become popular or maybe infamous about, which is challenging beliefs.
Yeah, thank you very much. So I was born in Zimbabwe, and my parents moved to Cape Town when I was about 5 years for business reasons and so on. And I went to school in Cape Town, then I went to university. I went to university in Cape Town. But I think the most influential factors in my life was having graduated from high school, I went to America for a year on an exchange program. And my mind was really expanded by that experience. It was just fabulous. But what happened when I was there was that Professor Christian Barnard performed the world's first human heart transplant on December the 4th of 1967. And I was absolutely agog at this. And 3 months later, I had no idea what I wanted to do with my life. And 3 months later, I woke up one morning and said, I'm going to study medicine at the University of Cape Town. So I applied and was successful. But I soon realized that medicine was not really for me. The practice of medicine was not for me, because there are certain things that you need to be a medical practitioner, and I don't really have them. And I realized I was much more interested in finding why, explaining things. Why does this happen?
Sorry to interrupt, Prof, but what are those things? What are the things that you need that you don't think you do have that a medical doctor would need?
Firstly, you have to have the desire to learn this textbook, which to become a physician, which I would presumably have become. I wouldn't have been a surgeon. I couldn't be a surgeon because when there's a crisis, I just become immobilized. And so that's totally not for a surgeon. Or emergency medicine. Those two I could never have done because I was a thinker and not really a doer. And I couldn't sit down and learn this textbook and then be asked, what are the 100 causes of a body temperature rising? And the person who knew 100 was better than the person who knew 99, and so on. So I was much more interested in trying to understand, why did the body temperature rise when you got an infection? That was my interest. And so fortunately, during my training, I met Professor Lionel Opie, who, like you, was a PhD student at Oxford. And he trained under Krebs, who was the great metabolic researcher at Oxford, and very much influenced him and another person who trained me. So I met Lionel Opie, and he was questioning, and he went into the library, and he was always finding out what was new. And that I'd never heard that before in my medical education. And it just so happened, this is chance. I was running at the time, and I had a great interest in heat stroke. And he was asked to give a lecture on heat stroke because it was what we call an orphan lecture. No one wanted to do it. And because he'd just come back from the United Kingdom, he was given this lecture. And afterwards, I went up to him and said, Professor, I don't really agree with you on this and that. And so we had a long chat. And then I realized that he was the person I wanted to study with, because he was the first lecturer who said, in this paper, it says. Everyone else said, in this textbook, it says. And I wasn't a textbook boy. So I went to work with him, and I got my PhD or MD with him. And then I realized that my interest, he was a cardiologist interested in hearts. I was more interested in the whole body. And so I started researching the whole body metabolism and function during exercise. And we started sports science teaching in South Africa at the University of Cape Town. And ultimately, we raised money for the Sports Science Institute of South Africa, which tries to apply our knowledge to improve performance in athletes. So I was going along fine. In 2010, I was a little overweight. I was not feeling so great. And then I read a book called The New Atkins for the New You. It came to me completely by chance. I got an advert on my email. It said, eat this diet and lose 6 kilograms in 6 weeks. Now, I tried to lose 6 kilograms in 6 weeks, and all I got was hungry. And it never worked. So I said, who are these people? And then I checked their names, and they were really good scientists. I knew their scientific reputations. I said, they've sold out to Atkins. And I was really angry. So I got in the car and drove down to the bookshop. I picked up a copy of the book. It was the last one. And I started reading it. And after 3 hours, I said, oh my gosh, I've been wrong for 33 years. I've been following the wrong diet for 33 years. So at lunch, I said, that's it. I'm going on the low carbohydrate or carb restricted diet. And the results were dramatic. I mean, I lost more kilograms than you could imagine. And my running performance improved and everything went better.
Yeah.
And so for me, it was personal experience. And I think you'll find that almost all the people who promote the low carbohydrate diet were in exactly the same position. They were overweight. They wanted to be thinner. They tried everything. They'd done the exercise bit. They'd done this diet. They'd done that diet, and none of it worked. And then suddenly they come across this low carb diet, which works miraculously without any effort. That's the key.
Yeah.
And so then they become certain that they can help more people. So that's how I became interested. But you asked the question, why did I challenge beliefs? Because that was my nature. And when I was running myself and training myself, it soon became apparent to me that the physiology that we were teaching didn't seem right. And when we set up our laboratories, there were certain key things that you are meant to find, and we couldn't find them.
Yeah.
And one of them was that when you exercise to exhaustion, you run out of oxygen.
Yeah.
And there's a certain way you're supposed to detect that running out of oxygen. We couldn't find it. And the problem was that at the time, so we'd write these articles, and then we'd say we couldn't detect
So,
this.
so what's the idea? Is the idea that the runner themselves will feel when they're running out of oxygen?
Yeah, the idea is that the muscles, that's right, the muscles run out of oxygen and they start to produce lactic acid, and the lactic acid poisons the muscles. That's the fundamental thing.
Yeah.
And we couldn't find it. So I started looking into the literature of the people. A.V. Hill, who was actually, he was he was from Britain, and I think he was more Cambridge related than Oxford. And he described this phenomenon in 1925. But he could only measure two things. He could only measure oxygen and lactate. So he assumed that the two were linked, and that his fatigue could be explained by those two variables, because he couldn't measure anything else at that time.
Yeah.
And that then became the gold standard teaching.
How do you even measure these during training? Like while someone is busy running, how does the actual measurement happen?
Yeah. So what Hill did and what we did when we started our exercise testing, we'd put people on a treadmill and we'd have them run faster and faster and faster. And then you put on a mask and you measure the exhaled air and you measure the carbon dioxide and oxygen content of the expired air. And that tells you what's happening in the muscles. And what Hill said was,
So does that also tell you about the lactate in the muscles?
no, then you have to measure that either in the bloodstream or in the muscles. Mostly we measure it in the bloodstream because it's quite quickly diffuses from the muscles into the bloodstream.
All right.
And so you can get a good idea of what's happening. So that's, if you went to any exercise laboratory in the world, that's what they'll do. They'll test you. But what we realized was that Hill never described that they ran out of oxygen. He presumed it. And then everyone accepted it because he was Hill, he was a Nobel Prize winner and so on.
Yeah.
And so then we started questioning that. And over about a period of 20 years until about 2001, we wrote about it, and I was invited to give a very important lecture overseas. And I thought, well, I'm going to write about all the things that are wrong in exercise science. And the one was that you run out of oxygen during exercise. So I presented the talk. And so this is why it's so funny, was that a year later, I'm in Finland about to give a lecture on the great Finnish runners.
Yeah.
And my friend who invited me, he pulls out the latest edition of Medicine and Science in Sports and Exercise. He says, "Oh, Tim, I noticed that they don't like your ideas." Yeah, and he shows me this article. Literally, as I'm getting up like this, as this, and I took a look, I said, "Okay, we'll address that afterwards." So anyway, they wrote a long article critiquing what I'd said, and it was the first time ever that someone had published the lecture and then had been critiqued. So anyway, I went back and then I looked very carefully at what Hill actually said, and which had been buried since 1925. And what Hill said was that the problem is not in the muscles, it starts in the heart. And I immediately realized he's absolutely correct, that if you don't have enough blood going to the muscles, which is the muscle at greatest risk? It's the heart. And so he said that there's a regulator, the heart talks to the brain, and the brain slows the heart's function down, and that protects you from damage. And I knew that was wrong because I had trained with cardiologists. I knew that the way you control that is you control recruitment of the muscles or use of the muscles.
Yeah.
And then I realized that that is what's happening, and that we call the central governor model. So there are so many things in exercise science you cannot explain as the muscle being the limiting factor.
Yeah.
It's always the brain. The brain will always stop you before you get into trouble.
Yeah.
And so that's where I ran into trouble, because if you've made your career saying that the muscle is the limiting factor and the muscle metabolism is the limiting factor, you finished, because now the evidence is that's not right. And so what happens to your career? So most people can't do anything, and they just accept the old story.
Yeah. So yeah, let's go into that, right? Like, because I was very interested in this. I've been running on and off as well since like 2020, and I've gotten back to trying to run seriously again. And then I actually, after a very good run this past December, I was back in South Africa. I actually, remembered. I remember watching a TED talk, and there was a professor there saying that, the brain, that the model of exercise that was there before was brainless. It only spoke about, okay, lactic acid building up because you're not getting enough oxygen to your muscles, and so on and so on. And he was challenging this. But I remember then I went back to the video and I watched it again. And I felt that surely the actual truth must be somewhere in between, right? It can't totally be the brain. Because I remember you even say fatigue is an emotion. I thought this was an extreme. But I also thought, the muscles only being the determiner of your exercise performance was also an extreme. I thought the truth was somewhere in between. What do you say to a skeptic like me who says, no, the truth must be somewhere in between?
You're not a skeptic because you've already accepted that the old is wrong. So that's your
Yeah,
skepticism has
do.
taken you to a new position. Okay, so if the muscles, there are a couple of simple things. The first thing is that when you start running, how do you choose your running pace? You see, that's the first thing.
Yeah.
And if it's the muscle metabolism, then you would have to start very fast. You build up the lactic acid, and then you have to slow down. That doesn't happen. And we know that we can tell that you just recruit more muscle or less muscle. That's number one. But number two, this is the real one. If you watch a great runner like Kipchoge or all the new great runners, and you watch them run a 10K race on the track, which lap is the fastest or which kilometer is the fastest? Now, that tells you immediately which model it is.
Yeah.
So if you say, if you believe the metabolism story, you have to say the first kilometer is the fastest because they're fresh and ready to go and so on. And
Yeah.
the 10th is the slowest.
Yeah.
It turns out 10th is the fastest. The final lap is the fastest. So if you went up to Kipchoge and said, tell me, how are you feeling at the finish? You'd say, no, I'm feeling tired. But you'd say, but you just ran your fastest K in the last 1 kilometer, the 10th kilometer. You can't be tired. Your muscles can't be tired. They've just performed the best.
Yeah.
So that's one of those what we call a black swan moment. And black swans are what you look for in science because they tell you everything. So that's the most important black swan there is, because that tells you the brain has regulated the performance and the lactic acid has a moderating effect, but it's not the real cause. The next thing is your muscle has very little ATP in it. That's the main initial source for relaxation. It has a tiny amount of ATP, but the rate of turnover is enormous. So you've got this tiny concentration, but it's turning over very, very rapidly. Therefore, it's incredibly sensitive to a change in turnover. If the turnover falls, the ATP is going to drop, and if the use exceeds the rate of production, muscle is going to run out of ATP within 2 strides. Now, when muscles run out of ATP, they go into rigor, which is what you see in dead people. The muscle no longer relaxes. Now, therefore, rigor is the endpoint of anyone who says metabolic factors limit performance. It has to be through rigor.
Yeah.
And that happens.
Ah.
And the reason it doesn't happen is first, there are 2 things. Firstly, the rate of ATP synthesis is much faster than the rate of breakdown. The ability to regenerate ATP from other sources is much, much faster than its rate of breakdown. So there's always a security there. But secondly, the brain will stop you. It'll never allow you to go to the point where that happens. And that's why you can watch all the athletics and sports and the Oxford and Cambridge boat races. People don't stop.
Yeah.
They don't. The guy stopped rowing, this year. I think it was last year. The Cambridge stroke stopped rowing or reduced his rowing during the last 200 meters or so and was in terrible shape. But he didn't go into rigor.
Yeah.
So something else happened that prevented the rigor.
So, just to get that straight, I think the argument is, okay, if it was the muscles and the lactic acid in them and so on, if that was the story, then we would see it by reaching this state of these muscles not relaxing. But that is not happening. Then there must be another thing that's limiting the exercise performance, and that's your motivation or what you're telling yourself about the exercise.
That's right. Well, that's the conscious thing. That's the conscious component, but there's a subconscious component, and the subconscious component is the one you can't override. And in the last few weeks, I've been reading more literature and I'm rewriting my book, Law of Running. And I've realized that I think performance is hardwired into your body. It's hardwired. And the reason I say that is because there's an interesting relationship between exercise performance and duration. It's an exponential curve. Now, there's no way you can produce an exponential curve with an on-off. You're an engineer, you probably understand it better. You can't produce this by an on-off switch, like you're either running or you stop.
Yeah.
The only way you can do that is if each contraction is slightly weaker than the previous contraction. It's like it leaves something behind. And that's what I think is happening. And what really changes that relationship is your training. You can lift that curve right up.
Yeah.
And the best athletes are the ones who sit obviously on the best curve. They can sustain a much higher intensity for longer. But to think that that's purely training, no, there's genetics there and then there's training. But, you can change your diet and you can do this and you can do that. They don't really make the difference. What really makes the difference is training.
Yeah. Yeah. Definitely. I found that very interesting. Now let's talk about this. You've become a leading advocate for this low carb high fat diet, which has sparked a lot of widespread sort of support, but also criticism. Could you start by explaining to us what the diet is and how it compares to conventional dietary advice?
Okay, so if you go back 3 million years ago and just think where we were in Africa, we were evolving in Africa, and we were on the plains, and all you saw when you looked on the plains were animals. You didn't see any maize or fruit or vegetables, you just saw animals. And what happened in humans is we started catching those animals, probably catching the babies initially, and eating them and increasing our meat intake. And that had profound effects on us. It increased our brain size because meat and saturated fat is the key to developing the brain. We got rid of this big gut that the chimpanzees and the apes have because they have to break down cellulose. And humans can't digest cellulose, neither can any other mammal. It's only bacteria, so you have to host the bacteria. So we had this enormous large bowel, which was full of these bacteria, digesting the cellulose and turning it into saturated fat. So we evolved on a high saturated fat diet, although we were eating carbohydrates in the forms of roots and shoots and those sorts of things. So the next thing that happened was, because we got rid of this gut, our pelvis got smaller and our legs got closer together, and now we could start running. And that running was very important to our evolution and tracking and so on. It gave us the increased brain power. Then probably about 160,000 years ago, all of humanity came down to a small group of humans living in the Southern Cape Coast. That is Curtis Marian's hypothesis, at a place called Pinnacle Point, which is near Mossel Bay. For a South African, you'll know Mossel Bay.
Yeah.
And his theory is that 120 to 160,000 years ago, the world was so cold that all the ice had moved, all the water had moved to the poles. And this increased the area that these proto-humans could live on. And they ate a lot of fish and a lot of shellfish. And the reason they survived there was because the temperature didn't change. It was the one part of the world where they were not exposed to all this coldness and the ice, etc. So his theory, for which he has pretty good evidence, is that we then started evolving even more because we had this diet which was full of meat and fish. And that's how we've been. And that's how the human body functions. There are two ways you can function: either burning carbs or burning fats. And there's no question that burning fat, being ketotic, and burning fat and storing any carbohydrate that you eat, you store it, you don't burn it. That's the state that humans evolved as. And what changed was 18,000 years ago, there was the revolution of the agricultural revolution, because we'd killed all the big animals. So we didn't have any more fat to eat.
Yeah.
And because of that, we had to find carbohydrates. And so we found the carbohydrates, and agriculture started. And that was the next revolution. And the revolution we're going through right at the moment is ultra-processed foods. So now being raised on ultra-processed foods, which are as far from the natural human diet as it's possible to get. And what we find, either in research or just observation of people, is that the moment they get off the ultra-processed foods onto a real food diet, their health starts to improve. The diabetes just goes away, the obesity goes away, the high blood pressure goes away, etc. And we have all the evidence for that. That it's, here's my great friends. This is the latest paper that just published this last week.
Yeah, toward a metabolic health intervention.
That's right. And this shows that 1 year on the low carb diet, it reverses all these abnormal conditions, which are purely caused by ultra-processed foods. And the important part of ultra-processed foods is its excessive carbohydrate content. Humans are not designed to eat a lot of carbohydrate.
Yeah, yeah. Well, you've just made this point about how evolutionarily this low carb high fat diet makes sense. So yeah, now let's move towards carbohydrates and their effect on exercise performance, if any. So yeah, as I alluded to a bit in the beginning, until like a few months ago, the longest distance I'd run was like a 21K. I've since run further than that.
Well done.
But now that I've gotten to longer distances, one of the things that you'll hear people advise you on once you start running further is this, carb loading idea, that you need to, eat a high carb diet, before that long run. So what is the role of carbohydrates in endurance exercise? And are they necessary? Are these carbs necessary for exercise performance?
Thank you very much for asking that question, because if you'd asked me 10 years ago, I would have given you a totally opposite answer. So I promoted that high carbohydrate diet, carbohydrate loading, from the 1969 onwards, and that was the standard.
Yeah.
About when I converted to the low carb diet and I realized it was so beneficial for health, I started looking into the science of the other side of the human performance. And I found some disturbing findings that the whole theory of carbohydrate loading is based on one original study in which it was an associational study. In other words, they looked at two things and they said, well, they must be causally related. And what they did was they tested these athletes when they'd eaten high carbohydrate diets or low carbohydrate diets. And they found that on the low carbohydrate diet, you performed much worse and you became tired very quickly. And then they measured the muscle glycogen, which is the carbohydrate in the muscle, and they said it's much lower at the start and at the finish in the people who had eaten the low carb diet. So they said they found a lovely relationship, a linear relationship between more carbohydrate in the muscles and longer exercise performance. And that became the gold standard.
Yeah.
Now, 4 years ago, I was involved in a debate a debate on low carb, high carb diets, and it didn't come off. But then I started thinking and I went through the literature, I started reading the literature, and then I suddenly noticed that from 1939 to 1967, when the muscle biopsy studies started, and when they started measuring muscle glycogen, during that period, we believed what had been shown in 1939. And there, their Danish clinician suggested during exercise that improved performance. Not before, it's during. And what that did was prevented your blood glucose from dropping. And that was accepted. It was completely accepted as the biblical truth. Then what happened was this new technology was developed, the muscle biopsy technique, in which you measure glycogen. And the people who developed the technique obviously wanted to become famous. So they said, you see, we've solved the problem. It's all muscle glycogen. So I went back and looked at a slide that I had shown 1,000 times, literally 1,000 times in lectures and so on. And maybe not 1,000, but you know what I mean. And there it showed that relationship. And it showed the muscle glycogen falling more and starting lower in the people who started with low carbohydrate diets. And they measured the blood glucose levels, and the blood glucose levels fell dramatically, but they were much lower in the group who had a low carbohydrate diet. So technically, to be honest, the scientists should have said, we didn't control for blood glucose. And we assumed it doesn't have an effect, but they knew because their own laboratories had shown it effect 50 years or 40 years earlier. They ignored it completely, and you can't do that in science. So that inspired me to start looking at the literature properly. And it took us 7 years, and then because everyone else had done the studies assuming this relationship existed, that it's muscle glycogen which is critical. It took us 7 years to do the definitive study, and it was published literally 2 weeks ago. And that's the study. And the title is Carbohydrate Ingestion Eliminates Hypoglycemia and Improves Endurance Exercise Performance in Triathletes Adapted to Very Low and High Carbohydrate Isocaloric Diets. So what we did for the first time in the world, we had reached the point where we now could do the definitive study. It took us 7 years, and it took 7 years accumulated wisdom, including writing a 100-page review article, which is currently in review, exhaustively researching all the studies of carbohydrates and exercise. And then you come to one conclusion. which is what we tested in this. And what we did was we took the same 10 triathletes and we broke them in two. And then we had the one group would go on a high carb diet. The other group at the same time would go on a low carb diet.
Yeah.
Then we tested them for exercise performance. They were just asked to exercise for as long as they could at a particular exercise intensity. So we had groups then who had a low carbohydrate intake or a high carbohydrate intake. And that's the way you manipulate the muscle glycogen. So if the muscle glycogen is critical, at the end of that test, the people on the low carbohydrate diet will do much worse than the group on the high carbohydrate diet because they start with less muscle glycogen.
Yeah.
And according to the theory, when you run out of muscle glycogen, you have to stop exercising. Well, we found no difference whatsoever in their performance. So low carbohydrate diet made no difference whatsoever to their performance. But the next thing we tested what about the glucose in the liver and the bloodstream?
Yeah.
Because no one had tested for both. They just assumed that it's carbohydrates. They'd assumed that carbohydrates act the same way in our body.
Yeah.
And when we gave both groups, we had them exercise a low carbohydrate diet plus glucose during exercise, high carbohydrate diet plus glucose during exercise. And we found that both performed better than when they didn't take glucose. Their blood glucose levels were normalized and their performance was exactly identical. So therefore, we showed that the scientists in 1939 had been correct. It's the blood glucose that regulates your performance as far as carbohydrates go. It's not the muscle glycogen. So this has huge impact because it means that what you eat before exercise is immaterial. But what you have to do during exercise is take some carbohydrate.
Yeah. Okay. I understand that. But can you explain what the sources of because it seems like you need a high or relatively higher blood glucose level for better exercise performance. But then aren't carbohydrates the source of glucose? Like, can I not raise my blood glucose level by having carbohydrates prior to my run, say?
Yeah. Okay. So what we show, and this became apparent to me as I worked through all the word papers over 4 years. And I must just make the point that we did some definitive studies, some of the best studies on how what you ingest during exercises is oxidized and used,
Yeah.
and what the effect is of starting with low carbohydrate or high carbohydrate. But we didn't realize the importance. We infused glucose into the bloodstream, and we didn't understand what we were actually doing until more recently.
Yeah.
So what we discover is that there are two pools of glucose in the body, two pools. The one is the large pool in the muscles, and the one is the small pool in the liver and in the bloodstream. And everyone's assumed that it's the large glucose pool that's important.
Yeah.
Truth is that they are independently regulated. So when you take carbohydrates in, they go into the bloodstream, and the body has a definitive response to that, because one of the most important homeostatic mechanisms in the body is to regulate your blood glucose, because blood glucose is very, very dangerous. If it goes too high, it causes arterial damage. If it goes too low, you'll die of brain supply, not enough supply of glucose to the brain.
Yeah.
And the body has evolved. The human body has evolved to keep that blood glucose like very close. Now, as soon as you put glucose into the bloodstream, or it tries to get rid of it, and it tries to use it as a fuel, so it pushes up your insulin, and that turns off your fat metabolism, so you burn glucose, and it dumps the glucose into the muscles and the liver. That's what it does. So, in my opinion, the glycogen or carbohydrate that we measure in the large pool is largely an overflow from the blood, in which the blood is trying to get rid of the glucose. It's not there as a major fuel.
Mm.
So that's where we're looking at the moment. But You asked the question, how much glucose do you need? Well, the other brilliant thing we did was we looked at the literature and we found that tiny amounts of glucose improve performance. What's happened today is if you open the literature and you hear the Tour de France, and even now, if you watch the tennis players, they told them to have 120 grams of carbohydrate an hour. That is ridiculous. We showed you just needed 10 grams an hour to fill the small glucose pool to keep your blood glucose normal. The moment your blood glucose starts falling, the brain sees it. It's not stupid. It's not going to force you to run with very low blood glucose levels because it knows the brain will be damaged. So it slows you down and you start getting symptoms. You get huge symptoms. And I ran 7 comrades and 2 of them, I became hypoglycemic, much to my regret, because I would have had great finishes in those 2. The other 5, I've sorted the problem out. But that would, for whatever reason, I didn't have it. And the hypoglycemia completely stops you running. And you just slow down, and then you stop. And if you take carbohydrates, you far off. And within 10 minutes, you're back to your pace. Now, that can't be because you filled the large glucose pool. It has to be because you filled the small glucose pool.
In the bloodstream.
That's correct.
Wow, that was interesting.
So to answer your question, if you're running, you run 21 Ks, you said, you probably don't need much glucose during. But once you go beyond 21, then you do need a little bit of glucose. But it's only 10 grams an hour, which is a pretty trivial amount.
And what are some good sources of that during, let's say, a run? Like when you're running, what would you be?
It really doesn't matter. It could be a banana, it could be glucose, because what we showed is that starch, it could be bread, it could be anything like that, that the carbohydrate is broken down very, very quickly and absorbed as glucose. So it doesn't really matter what you take in. It could be sweets, it could be anything that gives you some glucose.
Sure. This is interesting. I'm noticing a thread here. First, we talked about the central governor model of exercise, in which you were proposing that the brain is the regulator of exercise performance. And then now we're talking about blood glucose levels and how the brain won't allow your blood glucose to fall below some threshold to protect itself. So already I'm seeing a pattern that the brain is doing a lot of work here to regulate what happens. Another thing that you were involved with was to demonstrate that drinking too much water during exercise is bad for you. It led to a condition called exercise-associated hyponatremia, something like that.
That's right.
May you please describe to us what this condition is and how much fluid during exercise is too much?
Yeah, so this is the book I wrote, and it's a gem of a book. It's 12 years old, but everything is absolutely still true because it goes back to the history. And when you look at the history, then it all makes sense.
Yeah.
So what happened when I started running in 1972, running marathons, we weren't allowed to drink anything during, or you could drink very, very little. You could have one seconding station. And I think that was at 20 miles, 32 kilometers. That was the only drinking station.
Yeah.
And I realized that was wrong and started promoting fluid ingestion during exercise. And slowly the laws changed. And in 1976 was the first Olympic Games marathon in which they were allowed to drink a little bit more. It wasn't yet as much as it became. And then in 1981, the Comrades Marathon, which is, as you know, 90 kilometers in South Africa, they introduced this concept of drinking every kilometer, or 1.6 kilometers.
Yeah.
They provided fluid every 1.6 kilometers. Now that's we went to jump from nothing to every kilometer you could drink. Now, so it turned out that if you really wanted to get free fluids, run a marathon. There's nowhere else in the world where you get so much fluid.
Yeah.
You're not going to get as much fluid as you get running a marathon. So what happened in 1981 was that a lady she wrote to me 3 weeks after the Comrades Marathon, and she said what had happened. She had lost consciousness during the race. She'd been hospitalized. She'd been unconscious for 4 days, and they'd noticed her blood sodium level was very low, and then she recovered after 4 days. And she said, "What happened?" I said, "I've no idea. It's never been described
Mm.
in any athlete." So then I took her history, and I took the history from 3 other people who had also developed hyponatremia, either during Comrades or during the South African Ironman triathlon. And I noticed a trend that they'd all drunk a lot, and that in recovery, they'd passed a lot of urine. And the one guy, his urine had actually been measured. And there was another lady who I knew was anorexic because I'd helped her, and she knew every minute of the day what her weight was. And she said, "Prof, I started the run 4 kilograms heavier than when I started the race. And then I had to start walking during the race."
4 kilograms heavier at the end of the race.
Yes, that's right. In fact, during the run.
Mm.
So she knew everything. And so she'd put on, anyway, at least 4 kilograms. And so that was sort of confirmative. Then what next happened was the 1987 Comrades Marathon. I'm woken up in the middle of the night, and the doctor in Pietermaritzburg says, "Prof, I've got a tent full of people who have got hyponatremia. What do I do?" I said, "I don't know. All I know is don't give them fluids. Just don't, for goodness sake, give them fluids." So the next year, I sent one of my PhD students to Comrades, and he then looked after 8 people who were profoundly sick with this hyponatremia, and 2 of them stopped breathing. I mean, that's how bad it was. So anyway, they fortunately survived, and he monitored their fluid in recovery, and he showed that they all excreted excess fluid. And the one athlete had put on 6 kilograms. He got rid of 6 liters of fluid. So we then published a definitive paper saying that this is due to fluid overload. Now, at that very time, the American product called Gatorade had just been released.
Yeah.
And it was being promoted in the US as the solution to running fatigue. Yeah, if you're tired, you're dehydrated, so you must drink more. So everyone gets tired during a marathon, so they must all drink more. And they started drinking more and more and more. And I predicted that shortly thereafter, so this was sort of 1990s. Our paper was published in 1991. I predicted publicly that the first death in a marathon will happen in the United States, and it'll be a woman, because the women are smaller and they take less excess fluid to become overhydrated. In addition, they follow rules. They follow rules much better than men.
Yeah.
And that's exactly what happened in a race in California. And this went on for 10 years. It went on until 2002, when a lady collapsed in the Boston Marathon and she was hospitalized. And the autopsy was done, and they said, in the Boston Times, it said she drank too much Gatorade plus water. And I dedicated the book to her, because it was absolutely clear that that's exactly what happened. So today, we know that you shouldn't drink ahead of thirst. That's the key. So it came about because
Yeah.
the American College of Sports Medicine printed guidelines, which were funded by scientists, which was written by scientists funded by the industry. And that's what happens. And they all said you must drink as much as tolerable. And athletes did that, and they developed hyponatremia.
Mm.
Fortunately, not everyone will develop. Some people can overdrink and they'll still secrete their urine, but there's a small group of people with a genetic difference, and they retain the water. Even though they think they're becoming dehydrated, they're overhydrated, and they just keep drinking.
Yeah.
And that's the problem. And then they come to the medical tent, and what does the doctor say? "Oh, you collapse, you're dehydrated." So they give them more fluid, and that kills them. That's the issue.
Yeah. Yeah.
So the answer is, during exercise, you drink to thirst, and that's all you need to do.
Yeah. Just drink as you would otherwise drink if you're at home, right? Like, yeah.
Okay.
Nice. Again, the lesson is the brain will regulate. The brain will regulate.
That's right. And thirst, if you become extremely thirsty, your performance will go down. That's the key. And the diagnostic feature of dehydration is thirst. That is the one diagnosis. There's nothing else that we can measure in you that's as good as that.
Yeah. Nice. Okay. And next one. So in your X or formerly Twitter bio, you write spreading scientific information, not medical advice. What is the difference, and should there be a difference?
Okay, so I was told to do that legally. So what happened was, I don't know if you know my whole story, that after I promoted this diet, I read the history of cholesterol and heart disease and realized that was a complete scam. There was, again, associational relationship, which industry then used to promote the drugs, the statins. So there is no evidence that cholesterol causes heart disease. It's absolutely been disproven in the proper trials that you can try and lower your cholesterol, but it won't make any difference to your long-term heart disease risk. What you have to prevent is diabetes, diabetes, diabetes. That is what's causing heart disease. Now, cardiologists prescribe statins. They don't prescribe diabetes drugs because they're not endocrinologists. And unfortunately, they control the market. So the statins are what is promoted. So when I started talking about that, and in fact, in this book, which you might have referred to, Challenging Beliefs,
Yeah.
for the first time, I talked about the fact that cholesterol doesn't cause heart disease and statins don't work. And that immediately drew the ire of the local cardiologist and the industry, because the industry monitors what's being done by doctors. And if they notice the statin prescriptions are going down, they make sure that they get them up again by making the professors of cardiology say, if you don't take a statin, you're going to drop dead tomorrow. So that was the first thing that happened to me. And then the next thing that happened was the dietitians decided I was harming their practice because we wrote this book. This was the book that really fired everything up, The Real Revolution. And that was promoting real food, i.e. the low carbohydrate diet. And that came out and it caused a wave of unhappiness amongst dietitians. So one of them reported me to the Health Professions Council for a tweet in which I basically said that you should raise your children, your babies, on this type of food, real food, not the hyper-digested, ultra-processed food. And so she reported me, and the Health Professions Council decided I had to answer the charges. And I had two choices. I could say, okay, I'm sorry, I'll pay whatever, I'll pay the fault that I've did. I said, no, I'm going to court on this one. So I got two of the very best lawyers in South Africa who gave me their time for nothing, which was absolutely amazing. And we had 4 years, which were amazing. We were in court for 28 days over 4 years. And at the end, we won 13-0. We won 13 decisions against naught. and the irony is, it was all about like giving medical advice or medical information, you see. And fortunately, the mother had said babies. I was responding to, do mothers and babies, and should they do X, Y, and Z? It was mothers and babies. It wasn't to a mother and a baby. If it had been to a mother and a baby, that's advice. But to mothers and babies, it's information. And unfortunately, I didn't understand that at the time. And my lawyer said, you gave information, you didn't give advice.
Okay.
And in the end, that became one of the crux decisions, because the lady who had asked the question eventually wrote a tweet, and she said, thanks very much. I'm removing myself from this discussion because I've received all the information that I need. She didn't say advice. So I went to court and gave nine days of information, which is actually on the internet. There are about 60 videos of me presenting the information. So we took the opportunity to give all the information. But in the end, it came down to, was it advice, was it information? But the reality, it was never to do with nutrition. It was purely the Health Professions Council wanted to stop doctors saying anything that they disagreed with. It was completely to take away my free speech. And the two lawyers who looked after me said that's what it was all about. It was all about free speech. And that's why they defended me.
Well, I suppose what I'm taking out of this is sort of like to wrap up your response to this question is maybe medical advice is you admitting to be associated with some profession and peers and all of that, and medical sort of like scientific information, you're standing as an independent individual, I suppose.
Yeah. And the scientific information, it doesn't necessarily lead to advice to tell you what to do. You should do this or that.
Yeah.
It's left to the individual to make that decision.
Yes. Yes. All right. So there's this quote from you that I really loved, which says, "What I've learned in life is that 50% of what we teach is wrong. The probably so 50% it is. And our job as educated people is to spend our lifetime trying to figure out which 50% is which. And until it is disproven, accept that for which the evidence appears solid and logical and is free of covert or overt conflicts of interest. Because unfortunately, industry is driving what you believe in many, many things, but don't ever dismiss lightly that for which there is credible evidence. That is reverse gullibility. There is such clear evidence that the diets we're eating today are horrendous and we need to change them. We shouldn't be ignorant of that, question everything else, but eventually the truth has to prevail. It always prevails. And so aim to be on the right side, on the side of the truth." Now, this struck me like as a profound thing to say. I sense a personal commitment to truth in it. And how do you personally navigate that uncertainty that is inherent in scientific discovery, right? The struggle between my best tools of analysis tells me that the conventional wisdom is not true, but also you're thinking I might be wrong. How do you navigate that uncertainty?
Yeah, and I think in my way, I don't come out immediately and make a decision. I think about it for years.
Yeah.
And when I see the evidence, when I become convinced, it's a gut feel. When I become convinced that this is true, because I've seen all the evidence, and that's what I do. I go back in history. People today, we don't study the history. And if you read my books, you'll see I go back to the history, to the start of creation. And that's what helps you. And so then I get this gut feeling, and then I know, I kind of know, but I'm always ready to say I'm wrong.
Yeah.
And that's what I did in Law of Running. I said, gosh, I'm wrong. I tore the pages out off, off in one famous video. So I think you have to be honest enough to realize that you can be completely wrong. And, I just look out at the universe, and the universe is so enormous and we can't explain, we can't, where did it all come from? If you really think that you are the final arbiter of truth, you're stupid. And so I try to be humble about it. But when I think it's true, I go for it. And then, of course, that's why is that good? Because then people come and say, but you're wrong. And then you look at that. And I take it very seriously when people criticize me. I look very seriously at their evidence. And if they prove me wrong, I will come out immediately and say, listen, I'm completely wrong on this one. But and that's the way you advance knowledge. And so, but I'm happy to acknowledge when I'm wrong.
Yeah.
And I think, for example, the biggest medical scam in history was this vaccine that unquestionably was designed to hurt people, to kill people, and to knock off future generations. And that's what the evidence is. Now, I didn't know that at the time, but when I saw the first data that Pfizer released, I could see the data was ridiculous. I mean, I spent my life trying to prove what works and what doesn't work. And it was clear that they hadn't bothered to look at whether it really worked or whether it was long-term safety. And this was accepted. My colleagues accepted it and critiqued me for saying the evidence doesn't show it. And around the world, we were all criticized. Anyone who said that the vaccine wasn't safe and effective was criticized and shut down, and some people lost their right to practice medicine. Now, 3 years later, we know that we were all speaking the truth because we looked at the data, and the data didn't show what the interpretation was. And that's a classic example of how industry just manipulates the thinking of, and this wasn't just the thinking of the doctors. They managed to completely brainwash the whole world. It's astonishing how they achieved it, and that's because they understand psychology. So that's why I think it's important to stand up and to know when the science is good and when the science is fraudulent. And it becomes, as you get older and you do more research, it's much easier to spot fraudulent research. I saw Elon Musk, he had a tweet yesterday or the day. He said, the people who complain the most, they're the ones who are the frauds. Because they're investigating who's stealing the money, etc., from the American government. And he said the ones that come out and say, are the most angry, they're the real fraudsters. And in medicine, it's the same. The ones who complain the most, they have got a reason to complain like that. And when they go from becoming emotional about it, they've got a problem that they're trying to hide.
Yeah, okay, Prof, we're running out of time. But yeah, on that last point about the vaccine, I think that could be another episode on its own.
Yeah.
So I don't know if you'll indulge me, but I think in future I will have to invite you so that we can talk about that more.
About a year ago, I wouldn't have been, because the evidence wasn't out in the public domain. In other words, I knew the evidence, I'd seen it. And I've also looked at the history of vaccination, and that's very dubious. There's some bad boys there. And Pasteur, who sort of started it all, or after Jenner, is one of the worst. He's unbelievably a dubious scientist.
Yeah. All right. I have to let you go now. But before I do, I see that you read quite a lot, and I think you read far and wide. Could you please suggest maybe say 2 or 3 books that you think everyone should read?
Yeah, I think if you want to get back to the base of nutrition, Nina Teicholz wrote a book, The Big Fat Surprise. And that's one of the best books that changed my opinion of cholesterol and heart disease. So that's a really brilliant book. She needs to be promoted. She now is on Kennedy's team in the US, trying to change the dietary advice there. I think that's a really good book. What other topics could I suggest? Would you like to ask me what book? Because I read mainly scientific books, and you'll see there behind me, there's all historical books there.
It could be any book. It doesn't have to be nutrition or sports science.
Yeah, it's
Books that you think have influenced you.
well, obviously the Atkins book, the low Atkins, sorry, the new Atkins for the new you was hugely influential for me.
Mhm.
In carbohydrates and exercise, the guys to look at is Dr. Volek. He was brilliant on that. Any books that I've written that I would suggest, I think the new edition of Law of Running it's so revolutionary
Okay.
that what we've talked about today is right in the book, but it's integrated. So the whole book, including all the training, that we try to analyze, well, what's happening with these different training methods that are valuable. I'll tell you the books that really influenced me were written by George Sheehan, Dr. George Sheehan. He was a runner in the 1970s, 80s, and 90s, and he sort of led the philosophy of running, and he was an absolutely astonishing writer, and there's no one come close. But unfortunately, his books are not really available, but that's one book that if you have a bent to understand why you run and why you find it so rewarding,
Yeah.
and why you think that it's important to push yourself all the time, he's the man, Dr. George Sheehan. I
What's
think one or two of his books
book?
are available.
What's the title of his books?
Well, the one is This Running Life. But if you will be able to find them, if you put in George Sheehan on Amazon, you'll be able to find all his books. He was an amazing man. His last book he wrote was about his fight with cancer.
Mm.
And he set out to say, well, now I'm going to tell you how I lived and died with cancer. But he was just remarkable. As I said, there's no one comes close to his writings. And I was fortunate. I read it, and he used to send me let me just get them. I'll show you now.
Sure.
So he used to write for a journal as well, the Physician in Sports Medicine. And this was one of his great articles. It's called A Lonely Figure on a Lonely Road.
Yeah.
I am a lonely figure when I run the roads. People wonder how far I have come, how far I have yet to go. They see me alone and friendless on a journey that has no visible beginning or end. From the security and safety of the automobile, I appear isolated and vulnerable. When I think about him, at this creature, it is all they can do to keep from stopping the car and asking if they can take me wherever I'm going. I mean, that's his writing. It's just,
That's beautiful. Yeah.
yeah. So he would send me all his columns, and this is just some of them. I mean, it's just some of the columns. I've got 3 other books with all his columns in them. So here, for example, so he used to write for the Daily Register in his hometown.
Okay.
Can't see it, but
George Sheehan.
yeah, and that's the Daily Register, and it's, random thoughts on the running life. Running a solution to energy crisis. Never give up is the message. I mean, it's just astonishing. I'm sorry I don't have his books here, though. They're elsewhere.
Yeah.
So he was very, very influential. So those are 3 books that really influenced my life. Nina Teicholz, the Volek book or the Westman book on the diet story, and then all of George Sheehan's writing.
All
I mean,
right.
they're very different. They're not books that people will find in the mainstream, but they hugely influential. And I never grow tired of his reading. I can read it's fresh today, as I can show you. It's as fresh today as it was 30 years ago when he wrote it.
Yeah. Nice. Nice. Thank you. Thank you so much, Prof. Tim Noakes, for your time. We've come to the end of our interview. And again, I appreciate you for slotting me into your schedule.
It's been a great privilege to speak to you, and I wish you all success at Oxford and completing your PhD, and look forward to your return to South Africa. And I hope I'll be able to talk to you when you're back in South Africa.
Thank you.
All right.
Likewise. Bye.
Bye.